Internet is actually billions of layers of abstraction. And the data passes through all these layers, and these layers are not like, static. They keep on sort of, it's like an organism, which, contracts and expands, and like, it's like a very connected organism. The whole idea of internet, the internet which exists right now, it came from the edifices of a liberal democratic order. I mean, there were other kinds of internets as well. I mean, the Russians had their own internet, which was called OGAS. It did not fly. And the peculiar thing about this specific kind of internet, which stemmed from a very specific socio-political atmosphere, was that it encouraged decentralization. It encouraged end-to-end networks rather than centralized authorities. Number one, internet itself has encouraged what we call disintermediation, that the manifestation of a nation state over internet becomes very challenging. And that leads to the second phenomenon which we're discussing on cyber sovereignty. Cyber sovereignty itself is to establish statist control over internet. Any system which has a capability of surveilling people would surveil people. So the thing is, it's very likely that the cyber sovereignty would lead to structures which are more restrictive, which introduce a lot of element of control, even more so than it exists in the larger world. So there are no two schools of cyber sovereignty. There is the decentralized internet, and there's this idea of sovereign internet, which, let's say, nation states like Russia and China have espoused, and they've strongly sort of lobbied for it. It's a pivotal movement for structures of society which are going to get created in the future, because the underlying structures are all driven by technology. These are things which are going to make or break nations and their societies. If our idea of cyber sovereignty or lack of it is very statist, that it espouses the state, the legitimacy of the nation state rather than the legitimacy of the society which the state is serving, then it would lead to friction when it comes to civil liberties, or when it just comes to egalitarian syncretic constructs which a society would need. And in any case, this kind of challenge to the decentralized internet is also challenging a liberal democratic order. And it's natural for a state and its structures to be a little nervous about the lack of control, but it has to come up with a larger perspective as to what its implications could be. Governments would come and go, but then they could leave a legacy which would, could change our societies forever. We are coming to a point where, first of all, as I mentioned, disintermediation, which is the dwindling of statism in cyberspace, that states cannot manifest themselves in cyberspace. That has to be addressed at different levels. It requires a very extensive global discussion. And the second thing is that with these structures coming in, societal structures, they are basically technological structures which have now become societal structures. Are we rewriting our social contract with the state? This is the biggest shift in our understanding of a social contract and how it manifests. We have to understand the phenomenon from an interdisciplinary perspective, and only then we should rush to creating policies or doing something under the pretense of national security or whatever. Now, coming back to India's stance, we have to go back and understand our historical stance. Our sort of foreign policy deliberations over cyberspace sovereignty were undertaken by diplomats. And, it's just this nature of the beast is such that, it's a very complicated issue. And so being handled by diplomats, I think our stance was slightly schizoid, or we switched sides, or it was very unclear. And the lack of clarity itself is sort of now, it is sort of solidified. And I think I would not call it that we are inching directly towards the Chinese model, but it seems like there is a certain shift right now towards more, and there are some precedents to that, like COVID could be one, or anything. You could, the Chinese escalation. But it does feel like the state is trying to assert itself in cyberspace, the Indian state, a little more actively. But yes, I would call it a slight shift towards kind of like that school of thought. Data localization is a purely political maneuver. And I'm not saying it is political maneuver attributed to a certain party or a government. It's actually just the essence in which it manifests is purely political. We say that, okay, you know, these new colonial structures are getting all our data. That argument is true to a certain extent, but incidentally, you know, yes, I mean, that's certainly valid to a certain extent, but we have to dissect the problem very specifically. We just cannot, you know, use such extensive metaphors or such rhetoric to just, you know, carve a counter narrative. When you read the data localization policies, they talk about a few companies and specific kinds of data sets. And I can tell you the internet is not, the internet doesn't exist like that. Internet is actually billions of layers of abstraction, and the data passes through all these layers, and these layers are not like, you know, static. They keep on sort of, it's like an organism which, you know, contracts and expands, and like, you know, it's like a very connected organism. Every layer has the capability to extract the data. And so talking about data localization, let's say, without talking even at all about whatever hardware manufacturing policy is, like chipsets and all that, I think it's just it's a bit of an arm twisting of certain hegemonical companies. I mean, it's fine if you do it, but it doesn't solve the data localization problem, you know, what you're trying to do. Data which is going to go out would go out no matter what, because, you know, as I mentioned, there's so many layers of abstraction. The idea here is that data localization also gives a piece of the pie to the nation state. So what data localization does is actually just offer our government some data as well. It doesn't it doesn't cut off the conduits of overseas data. It just gives them access as well. Now, what they want to do with it, why they want it, is a question we should ask.